I'll get started and then anyone who joins can join in midway. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on biodiversity friendly designs and mitigation measures in the development of offshore renewable energy, with hopefully a focus on Ireland, but in general as well. We've had a really great response to the webinar. As I said, we had over 150 people registered, which I think is a really great indication of the interest in the topic and in making sure that ORE is done in the most sustainable and least impactful way, particularly at the stage that we're at in Ireland. So please note, as I said, that the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website within the next kind of 24 to 48 hours. So if you want to go back and have a look at it afterwards, or if you have any colleagues that weren't able to make it, you can point them to that afterwards. And in the next kind of couple of months, I'll also have a shareable and digestible infographic to go along with it. So today we'll have 3 presentations by 3 guest speakers, which I'll introduce in a little while. And after the presentation, I'll then relay the questions to the speakers. So we'll wait until the end of the 3 presentations. And then any questions you have, as I say, put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So before I introduce our first guest speaker, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to who I am and the project that I represent. My name is Dr. Jenny Bortoluzzi. I work at the Irish Environmental Network, which is an umbrella network that works to support national environmental NGOs in Ireland through access to funding and services. It consists of environmental NGOs that carry out their work through practical conservation work, campaigning, lobbying, and raising public awareness of environmental and conservation needs. At the IEN, I specifically run the MARÉIRE project, which stands for Marine Renewable Energy and the Irish Environment. So the project began in 2024 and runs for 3 years. It aims to build capacity in our sector around the topic of offshore renewable energy and its interactions with the environment in Ireland. We hope to provide opportunities, skills, and knowledge and funding for our groups, but also the wider community to get involved in these topics. This includes funding for research, event organising, legislative and policy work and advocacy, developing knowledge and skills among our members and the wider community through webinar series such as this one. And we also hope to or aim to develop cross-sectoral relationships and partnerships and just generally working on the topic in different ways. The team is made up of myself as the project coordinator, Dr. Stephen Comerford and Rochelle Strecker, who are based within our 2 sub-grantee partner organisations, the Irish Whale and Dolphin Group and Birdwatch Ireland. You can find out more about the project, our outputs and opportunities that we currently have up at marére.ie. Without further ado, I am going to introduce our first speaker, Manon Thiel. Manon Thiel is actually Thiel. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that, Manon. But Manon is an ecologist with a strong background in wildlife conservation. She's currently working as a manager in the energy and nature team at the Renewables Grid Initiative, or RGI, an NGO that's based in Berlin. At RGI, she focuses on the environmental impacts of offshore wind and grid infrastructure on nature within the multi-stakeholder coalition called Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, or OCEAN. And amongst her other projects, she also leads activities related to bird protection along electricity grids in Europe. Thanks so much for joining us, Manon, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Jenny, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Give me 1 second while I share my screen. Okay, can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. So, hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks a lot for the invitation. So my name is Manon Thiel, and as Jenny said, I work for the Renewables Grid Initiative. We are an NGO based in Berlin. And today I will introduce you the multi-stakeholder initiative that we have, that we created in 2020, the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, and one specific stream of work that we have, which is the mitigation of offshore wind and grid infrastructure impacts on nature. Um, so, yeah. So Ocean, as I said, is the shortcut for the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, and it encompasses various organizations from across Europe, including NGOs, wind industry actors, and transmission system operators, or TSOs. And together we have joined forces to accelerate the deployment of offshore wind energy and grid infrastructure, hand in hand with protection of marine ecosystems. So we have two coalitions that RGI created and managed, one in the North and Baltic Seas and one in the Mediterranean and Atlantic waters. And altogether, we have 11 grid operators, 11 TSOs, 19 wind industry representatives, and 20 civil society organizations. And to look a little bit closer into the members of the coalition, this is the coalition from the North and Baltic Seas, with the type of stakeholders that I just mentioned, so NGOs, grid operators, wind industry representative, and RGI is at the center, acting as the convener, the moderator of the group. Today we're speaking at a webinar for Ireland, so I can mention that, for example, we have AirGrid, the grid operators from Ireland that is a member of of Ocean, but we also have Wind Energy Ireland as a member. Very briefly, because it's less on the topic, but we also have this coalition in the Mediterranean and Atlantic basins, which is very similar in terms of stakeholder group. It was established in 2023, recognizing the growing offshore wind capacity in the Mediterranean and Atlantic basins and the need to carefully manage its deployment in a region that is a biodiversity hotspot. But what do we do exactly? So within the two coalitions, we provide an open forum for discussion for stakeholders having sometimes different interests, priorities, and together we create common understanding on key topics in order to advocate for offshore wind and grid deployment in hand with nature protection. And to do so, we collect innovative practices, we showcase solutions from our members, and we identify together knowledge gaps to work on. And what are the topics that we cover? So there are various, but a few examples is maritime spatial planning as a key tool to accelerate the deployment of infrastructure in a nature-friendly way. Also coexistence with other activities such as fisheries or nature. Auctioning is also a big part of our stream of work, and in particular, ecological criteria in offshore wind auctions. We have, by the way, recently published a statement on this topic specifically for the Mediterranean basin. I can share the link in the chat right after my presentation, and feel free to have a look at it. And of course, another big topic that we work on is the mitigation of environmental impacts. We also work on restoration of ecosystem, nature inclusive design to achieve nature positive outcomes around infrastructure. But now the topic of so this was to present you the coalition, and I want now to jump in the specific topic for today, which is the mitigation of environmental impact, which is one of the work stream of RGI. But before that, I would like to introduce you to the mitigation hierarchy. I hope you've heard about this, which is absolutely essential to follow for effectively implementing constructing infrastructure. So the mitigation hierarchy guides the developments through 4 steps. The first one is to avoid impacts by carefully selecting the sites where the infrastructure will be installed. Then the second step is to mitigate unavoidable effects through minimization measures. Then restore damaged habitats to their natural state, and offsetting residual impacts by supporting equivalent environmental gains elsewhere. This is the hierarchy. There are sometimes different ways that the mitigation hierarchy is shown, but this is the one that we have agreed with our members within Ocean. And applying this to offshore wind projects helps to protect marine ecosystems while advancing the development of the necessary infrastructure. And when we started to work on this topic, and specifically on avoidance and minimization measures, we realized that they were scattered, fragmented, and information were not necessarily up to date. And there was also some disagreements between key stakeholders. So therefore, we decided with our members to collect mitigation measures and specifically avoidance and minimization measures for bottom fixed offshore wind, because in that case, it was specifically for within the coalition in the North and Baltic Seas. So for bottom fixed offshore wind and grid infrastructure during planning, construction, operation, and decommissioning for the offshore wind farms in the North and Baltic Seas. And those measures were embraced by our members, so the NGOs, wind and grid developers, which have more than 20 years of experience. But very quickly, what is avoidance and minimization measures? So the avoidance measures prioritize the identification and selection of project sites or location within a site, which will have a minimal ecological impact and thereby reducing the likelihood of significant harm to marine habitats and species. While minimization measures focus on reducing the impact through the adoption of best practices when it comes to design, construction, operation, and decommissioning. So, for example, employing advanced technologies to minimize noise or vibration during installation and implementing these measures to mitigate seabed disturbance. What we did not include in this collection of measures is nature-inclusive design solutions, enhancement on and off-site restorations, and offsetting measures, just to be clear on what was in that collection. And how did we collect those measures? So we applied a structured framework that considers every project phase from planning, construction, operation, and decommissioning. And we started by identifying the main pressures associated with each phase, such as noise, light emission, habitat disturbance. And these pressures were then linked to relevant receptors like bats, birds, fish, and so on. And next, we examined the potential impacts on these receptors, like collision risk, displacement, attraction, so on and so forth. And this were classified between avoidance measures or minimization measures. And the very last step of this framework was to organize them by their status, if they were already implemented, if they were tested, or if they were still at a concept stage. So all this information was gathered through literature reviews, through interviews with our Ocean members, and internal discussions, ensuring that the measures are grounded in current practice and expert knowledge. The result is that we have now a database with approximately 80 avoidance and minimization measures. So again, I'll share the link. This is fully accessible on our website. I'll share the link after the presentation. We also drafted a report that you can see on this picture with a brief overview of the collected measures. We identified knowledge gaps, best practice for offshore wind and grid developers, and recommendations for policymakers. This report also had interest at the national level because we translated to French, for example, and it was also presented to the Dutch Minister of Climate and Green Growth by our ocean members in the Netherlands. And finally, we also produced this beautiful infographic that summarizes the measures. Again, you can find everything on our website. I want to walk you through very quickly the database, which is available on our website, so let me press play. I hope you can see. Because within Ocean, we want to make sure that data are transparent and shared publicly. We created this database. So you can select the type of pressure, and you see all the measures that we have identified together with our members. You also see the receptor. You see the measures if it's for wind turbines or if it's for grid infrastructure, and the status of development in the last column. You can also filter the life cycle phase directly to only have planning, construction, operation, or decommissioning phase. So here are a few examples that I wanted to give you of the measures that we have identified. So for example, siting or micro-siting, which involves positioning the turbines or the infrastructure away from areas that are valuable for sensitive species or away from migratory routes, for example. Another example is optimizing the timing of construction and using the least intrusive equipment during service to minimize disturbance. When planning the infrastructure, you can also site substations to reduce the number and length of cables, which helps limited seabed disturbance. During construction, noise reduction methods such as this bubble curtains can lessen the impact on marine life. And during operational phase, it's important to reduce collision risk for birds and bats through appropriate design or management measures. And finally, during decommissioning, extending the lifespan of infrastructure can help reduce the environmental impacts by delaying or minimizing intrusive activities. So what's next? What we have now that we have produced this beautiful report and infographic and database, we will have this annual revision of the collected measures through, again, conversations with our members. What was, for example, in the test phase, does it now have results? Again, just to give a revision of the measures. We also want to focus on the knowledge gaps that we have identified. So, for example, bats is a stream of work that we will start to work on by next year. So what is the impact of offshore wind on bats and how to minimize this? And of course, we always have activities of dissemination, communication, and advocacy. As I said, our reports and documents are shared at the European level, for example, the NSEC meetings, or it was also shared to some ministers thanks to our ocean members. So this is my last slide. I want to give you the opportunity to scan the QR codes if you want. This is to register to our event mailing list if you want to hear more about our next events, and you can also visit our website. But as I said, I'll share the links of everything that I just talked about in the chat. So thanks a lot, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Manon. You're still sharing your screen. So yeah, there we go. Perfect. Thank you, Manon, for that really interesting presentation and really important report that ORGI has produced. So yes, we'll share the links. Manon will put them in the chat now, but I'll also link them when I share the recording of this webinar online. So as a reminder, please put your questions, if you have any, in the Q&A box or in the chat at the bottom of the screen. And I'm now going to introduce our second speaker, Daniel Mitchell. Daniel is a biologist with 15 years of experience in the environment and nature conservation sector. And for the past 6 years, he has worked for BirdLife, leading the marine program and supporting the marine work of BirdLife national partners in the Europe and Central Asia region. In this role, he focuses on various topics, including marine protected areas, sustainable fisheries, marine restoration, and the ecological impacts of offshore renewables. So, Daniel, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny, and good morning to everyone. I'll just share my screen. Can you let me know when you see it in full screen mode?
Yeah, you are good to go.
Perfect. So today I'm going to be talking to you about aligning offshore wind development and bird conservation. And just to start with, for those of you that are not aware of BirdLife, we are a global partnership of more than 120 national conservation organizations together with a global team. And we work to unite and strengthen conservation across borders so that birds and all life can thrive. And hopefully many of you here today know BirdLife's Irish partner, Birdwatch Ireland. I just want to start off by setting the context in which the development of offshore renewables is happening. So the latest OSPAR assessment, which is from 2023, shows us that seabird populations across the Northeast Atlantic region are in a poor state. And in Ireland specifically, all but one of the 24 species of breeding seabirds currently has an unfavorable conservation status. And this is particularly relevant for the development of offshore renewables because birds are particularly vulnerable to negative impacts from offshore wind farms. And offshore wind farms affect birds in three main ways, the first of which is collision. So this is where birds flying at the turbine blade height hit blades, resulting in mortality. And the risk of collision depends on factors such as the turbine size and design, species-specific factors such as the flight height and maneuverability, as well as foraging behavior, but also weather conditions such as wind speed and direction and visibility. Some of the seabirds that are particularly at risk of collision include many of the gull species and the northern gannet. But also migratory birds are at risk of collision when they pass over the sea during their migration. The second way birds are affected is through displacement, and this is where birds avoid an area due to the presence of offshore wind turbines. And this results in a loss of habitat that they may previously have used for feeding or for resting. And some of the species that are at high risk of displacement include the northern gannet, species of auk, such as the common guillemot and the razorbill, and red-throated divers. And it's important to mention here that displacement effects may occur well beyond the boundaries of a wind farm. So there are studies in the German North Sea on the red-throated divers that found strong displacement effects up to 5 kilometers from the edge of the wind farm. And these effects can remain significant at distances of up to 10 to 15 kilometers from the wind farm. The third way birds are affected is through the barrier effect, and this is where the wind turbines interfere with birds' movements. This can either be the regular movements of breeding seabirds between their colonies on land and their feeding areas at sea, or for migratory birds traveling between breeding and wintering grounds. And this means that they have increased flight distances, meaning that the birds are spending more time and using more energy to reach their destination, and this can potentially affect their survival or their breeding success. Wind turbines also alter water turbulence, affecting mixing and stratification, with potential impacts on productivity and food availability in an area. And this may also have potential impacts on seabird populations, but these are not yet very well understood. So the big question is, how can Ireland scale up offshore wind to tackle climate change while also safeguarding its important seabird populations? So first thing, location is key. It's one of the main factors determining the likely ecological impacts of an offshore wind farm. So selecting the best locations for developments is critical. And this is not only in terms of avoiding ecological impacts, but there are also benefits for industry as well, as it can reduce the need for expensive mitigation measures. It can increase acceptance and prevent opposition to new developments. And it can also avoid delays during the approval and permitting process for new developments. Now, avian sensitivity maps are a key tool for informing the spatial planning of renewable energy technologies such as offshore wind. And BirdLife has been pioneering the use of these in countries around the globe. These maps classify areas of the sea from high to low sensitivity based on the bird species present. And when you combine these with other ecological data layers for other species and other spatial information, for example, on wind speed or water depth, it enables you to identify areas where offshore wind farms are technically feasible and where ecological impacts will be minimized. And just to mention here that our partner Birdwatch Ireland is currently seeking funding to do an avian sensitivity map for offshore wind in Irish waters to inform the national DMAP process that's underway in Ireland. So when identifying areas for offshore renewables, it's important that this is integrated in wider ecosystem-based marine spatial planning. And a key element of this is identifying and designating areas for marine protection and restoration targets. And for EU member states such as Ireland, these targets are contained in the EU Biodiversity Strategy for marine protection and in the EU Nature Restoration Regulation for marine restoration. And just to mention here that these marine restoration targets not only cover marine habitats, they also cover the habitats of marine species such as seabirds. So one of the things that BirdLife and Birdwatch Ireland have done recently to support area-based protection efforts in Ireland is to collate and analyze available data for Ireland's 24 breeding seabirds to identify IBAs. Stands for Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas. And these are sites identified using standard criteria and thresholds, and they represent the most critical sites for seabird conservation in Ireland. This work resulted in 49 coastal IBAs. The majority of these were existing sites that were updated, and 24 marine IBAs. These sites qualify for protection as SPAs, so special protection areas under the EU Birds Directive. And for many of the coastal sites, they are already designated as SPAs, but this is not the case for the marine sites. And these sites should also serve as a key spatial layer when planning the location of offshore renewables. So in the case of Ireland's South Coast Designated Maritime Area Plan, the South Coast DMAP, two of the areas that have been defined for offshore winds, so area A and B, as you see it on the slide, overlap fully with one of the marine IBAs we identified, while the other two areas, areas C and D, partially overlap with this IBA. And this area is particularly important for the northern gannet and the black-legged kittiwake, both of which are species considered to be at high risk of collision with offshore wind turbines. So once locations are selected for offshore wind farms, site-specific environmental impact assessments should be conducted to inform the application of mitigation measures. Most of these measures need to be considered at the design or planning phase of an offshore wind farm, and the main measures for birds are increasing the turbine height or the air gap, which means that less birds will be flying at the blade height, and therefore there's a lower risk of collision. Increasing the turbine blade visibility so that birds can see the turbines better and are less likely to collide with them. Modifying the lighting used in the wind farm to reduce the attraction of birds towards turbines, and adjusting the layout of turbines to create corridors that allow for bird movement, but also movement of other marine species through the wind farm site. During construction, the main measures are avoiding, reducing, or phasing construction activities during sensitive periods. Obviously, this is not just relevant for birds, but also for other marine species. And in areas where you have several species of concern, it may not be possible to fully avoid all of the sensitive periods for these species. And the second measure is focusing on vessels, so reducing the number of trips or adjusting vessel speed or routes to avoid sensitive areas and therefore minimize disturbance. During the operational phase, the main measure for birds is bird curtailment or shutdown on demand. And this involves slowing or stopping the turbines during periods of high collision risk. And this can either be done in real time based on data collected from cameras or radars deployed in the wind farm to detect when there are a large number of birds present. Or for migratory species, you can use models that use weather data to predict periods of high migration and that allow shutdown to be scheduled in advance. And just to say here that BirdLife recently published a report that looked at the different approaches for developing, implementing, and monitoring bird curtailment in offshore wind farms, and also exploring how this measure could be coordinated between countries at a sea basin level. So I think it's important to highlight here that for some measures, there's still a lack of knowledge about their effectiveness for different species and under different conditions. And one example of this is blade painting. So there was a study in Norway that was conducted between 2006 and 2016 that indicated that painting one blade black could significantly reduce bird collisions. However, a more recent study in the Netherlands in a very different setting found no impact on bird collisions. Potentially, this was because the black blade didn't contrast enough with the busy background. And there's now a new offshore wind farm in the Netherlands that will trial turbines with one blade painted red. And the kind of message from this is that monitoring and reporting of the results of mitigation measures is really important for building this knowledge base. So one way to incentivize additional efforts by developments to minimize ecological impacts is using non-price criteria in offshore wind farm auctions. But typically, auctions focus on price and aim to deliver renewable energy at the lowest cost. By using non-price criteria, which can cover factors such as biodiversity, sustainability, or community benefits, shift the focus of the auction from lowest price to wind farms that deliver the greatest overall value. So, for example, by minimizing impacts on marine species and habitats, or creating employment opportunities for local communities. And BirdLife also recently released a report looking at the use of non-price criteria in offshore wind farms and how they could support developments that minimize impacts and deliver benefits for birds. And in the report, we also identify the factors that are really important for the success of non-price criteria. And just to finish by saying, as I mentioned at the start, many seabird populations are already struggling, and the development of offshore renewables is adding an additional pressure. So if we want to halt and reverse these current declines, we not only need to minimize the impact of offshore renewables on seabirds, but we also need to act to deliver the things that seabirds need to thrive, such as safe places on land to breed and at sea, ensuring plentiful food, and addressing causes of adult mortality, such as bycatch in fisheries. And just to say that we can have a renewable energy transition that delivers for climate, for nature, and for people if we plan well, if we apply mitigation, and if we also invest in protection and restoration of our seas alongside the rollout of renewables. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was a great presentation, really interesting. I'm going to move straight to Sarah so that we have time for questions at the end. So introducing Sarah now. Sarah Cosgrove is a marine ecologist with over 15 years of experience across the marine sector in Ireland and the US. Her background spans population dynamics research, oil spill remediation, and offshore planning consultancy. She is the founder and CEO of Restore Blue, which is an island-based startup. She now draws on experience from both academia and industry to help offshore developers integrate nature inclusivity into their project sites. Thank you so much for joining us, Sarah, and over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. That's great. I will go ahead and share and try to be as quick as possible so we can get to a good discussion at the end. And if you can let me know when this is in full presenter mode, that would be great. Perfect. Okay, good to go. So I guess we finish off after two very good talks, focusing on biodiversity friendly designs and some focus on some nature inclusive technology. And that's what we specialize in at Restore Blue, and look at how they might be applicable to the Irish offshore development sector. So very kind introduction from Jenny, but it's not just me behind Restore Blue. We have a great internal team and strong scientific and research staff joining us on this call today. And they've put a lot of work in over the last few years building up what Restore Blue is. So what we are, we're not a consultancy. We are a software company, and the idea behind Restore Blue, having worked in both academia and in industry directly with offshore developers, was to put as much data as we could into their hands in a digestible sense, to build as much awareness as possible about the opportunities for nature inclusive design at offshore wind sites or offshore energy sites in general. So what we have built is our version 1 of the Restore Blue platform that we're now piloting with a number of offshore developers and marine consultancies. And it allows the developer marine consultancy to instantly identify site-specific nature-inclusive technology, those biodiversity-friendly technologies. It gives a full technical report on all those solutions and materials such as communication decks for engaging with stakeholders. We get our information on these solutions directly from the developers and suppliers of the solutions, so they feed into our back-end system and try to give as much information as possible about the ecological benefits, where it's been deployed, case studies, any evidence around how it has been validated in the field, any particular species that it has been seen to attract, and then some logistical information. So we position ourselves at the early stage decision-making for those offshore developers, hoping that they can then go on to make more informed decisions for their site and just on a higher level be aware of what's being done on a global scale. So as we all know, there's lots of opportunity, and this is a graph I'm sure most of us are very familiar with. Nature inclusive design tech is the level and the number of different innovations are rapidly growing on a global scale, and there certainly is a lot we can do here if it's planned for correctly to protect, restore, and even enhance the surrounding marine ecosystem. But it does come with its challenges. Obviously, the ocean presents very complex site-specific factors that need to be taken into account. There's uncertainties around the regulation of implementing and permitting nature-inclusive technologies on a national or EU level. And there's a lack of data at the minute, although there's emerging evidence for deployment of such tech. We still are at the relatively early stage of understanding how it performs in the environment, which is very much region-specific. And then another challenge is what happens to that technology once it's deployed. And a challenge for the developers successfully. So that's where we want to support. And of course, we want to support the future offshore Irish wind farms. And I'm sure most people here at the webinar are aware of the status in Ireland, but perhaps for those that aren't, I'll just quickly mention that we have 5 in planning, going through the planning review process. Although all of those 5 farms are located on the east of Ireland. And then on our South Coast designated marine area plan, we have 4 sites, the first of which, Tunnua, is going to auction very soon, hopefully in the next few weeks. And then there'll be a phased auction process for the other 3 sites. Drafting of a national designated marine area plan effort has also just begun. So we're really hoping that we can help support at an early stage with these projects to show the opportunity for nature inclusivity and provide as much evidence as possible to ensure it's planned for correctly. So I'd like to just highlight a few innovative technologies, simply because we talk about these technologies and maybe we don't often get a chance to talk about the innovation behind them. This is just an example output from our platform, and we don't rank solutions against each other in any sense. So we give the power and how the solutions are highlighted over to the supplier of the solutions. So presenting 5 examples from the platform today. So this is one life boosting unit from Ocean EcoStructures. So micro reef structure that can be seeded. It's a proprietary life boosting mix that can attract microfauna around the local ecosystem area, promote colonization, and has a multi-layer design that can enable a nursery effect. They also have a very advanced monitoring system, which allows them to monitor and count for biomass, oxygen generated, and CO2 uptake. So it has been deployed in various locations around Europe. Tree reefs is a very interesting innovation, and this is using trees that can be deployed alongside scour protection, obviously a completely natural resource known to attract the likes of shipworms, which can decompose the wood very quickly and release phytonutrients back into the ecosystem. It's not a solution that needs to be removed at any stage, as it decomposes fully within the environment, and acts as an artificial reef, attracting a number of target groups that you can see here. Going from quite a simplistic integration to quite an advanced, this is the Electro Reef AMA, and it's an example of multi-energy harnessing technology where you can deploy an artificial reef system that has the ability through electrolysis to generate hydrogen also within the same unit. So this is currently being trialed. It's quite an advanced tech. The artificial reef modules themselves have been deployed for some years and are showing great results within the system. The electrodes can be replaced, but the artificial reef system can stay in place to support that habitat that it has attracted. Another one some may be familiar with are the biohuts for floating offshore wind infrastructure by Ecocean, and a pilot study of this has recently been deployed in France at the Ocean Winds project. So this is to attract juvenile fish and give them a safer habitat in around the floating offshore wind infrastructure. And the inner cage of these structures are made from natural materials such as coconut fiber, oyster shells, etc. And Ecocean they are very keen about, developing monitoring methodologies that really specifically suit a site and a technology once deployed. ExoHub, these are pre-spatted oyster bricks that can be suspended beneath offshore infrastructure, and they're designed to kickstart an oyster reef habitat. They can be deployed at both offshore floating and around monopile structures to create that artificial reef. As mentioned, pre-spatted, and they're a modular design, so they can be adapted depending on the needs of the site. And then to look just quickly at 2 case studies. So some of you may be familiar with this Blå Wind case study led by the rich North Sea. And in 2020, 2,400 European flat oysters were placed within, as you can see here in the photo, these droppable, what they're calling tables. And then an extensive monitoring program has been running ever since to track the survival and growth and reproduction rates of the oysters. As of last year, there was a survival rate of 70% observed, and cod, cuttlefish, and multiple species of crab observed within the scarral layer protection and oyster tables. The nice thing about this project is until this artificial structure is decommissioned in 2028, it's going to be continued to be monitored and results shared, so there can be learnings from this case study. And then just to finish, so Restore Blue are starting a project in conjunction with the Marine Institute and the Department of Environment here in Ireland. And that's to look at how habitat restoration can coexist around our coastline and at offshore wind farms all around the island of Ireland. But we have a focus study that will take place at Arklow Bank Wind Park 1. And this is both a desk-based and field research study. So we'll have drop-down cameras to assess how natural reef habitats have promoted themselves in time in around the wind farm and the locations of those habitats. And the idea is to provide strategic guidance on how offshore wind and habitats can effectively coexist with Ireland's future DMAPs and marine spatial plans, and assist with the development of nature enhancement and rehabilitation plans. And we'll be very happy to share the learnings from this project. It's a one-year project once it's complete. So just to finish, our mission as a company is to accelerate the growth of offshore energy, but ensure where possible that we're embedding nature-inclusive design and making environmentally conscious decisions for those projects. We do believe that biodiversity restoration and climate adaptation could go hand in hand, but it needs to be planned for correctly. Data needs to be used intelligently, and we need to have as much evidence-based results available as possible, so that transparency across environmental data. And if anyone would like to demo the software, please get in touch. We'll be very happy to discuss. Thank you very much.
Beautiful, perfect. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for giving us a few minutes at the end for questions, all of you. So if anyone, just as a reminder, if anyone has any questions, you can either put them in the chat or in the Q&A box. If there are any in the Q&A box, oh, perfect. One just came through. Barry asks, just wondering whether fish hotels could encourage the buildup of pests and diseases. So I guess are fish hotels potentially encouraging alien species or non-natives? Sarah, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, and it's a good question and always a concern when you're putting something foreign into the environment. The key here, and Ecocean I know as a company are very strong on this, is to carry out robust assessments of the area before anything is deployed. So you have an understanding of what the local species are, if there are any potential invasive species within the area, and that is taken into consideration. So the best way to mitigate that is be as informed as possible about the local area that you're deploying a nature-inclusive technology into.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We also have a couple of questions in the chat. So Rachel asks, Manon, have Ocean done any work to create similar databases for offset or compensatory measures, or has the work been mainly for avoidance and mitigation measures? Maybe you can briefly tell us some of the other projects that Ocean has going on.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for the question. So in the work stream that I just presented with the report and the database, it was only on avoidance and minimization measures. However, we also have another database for nature enhancement and restoration projects, where we showcase innovative projects for offshore wind and grid infrastructure that can enhance and restore marine ecosystems. So again, I can share the link in the chat. We work also on nature inclusive design, of course, as it was presented by Sarah. So some of those measures are in the database, and some of those measures are also compensatory measures. So I'm happy to share that in the chat, and you can have a look.
Great. And as a quick follow-up, have all of the member wind energy companies, the member of OGI, have they all signed up to the measures that are presented in your report?
So, signed up, I wouldn't, I mean, it depends what signed up means in that case, but I would say, so the uniqueness of this report is that all the members, including the wind industry representatives and the NGOs and grid operators, agreed on those measures. A lot of them are being tested by some of our members, and they all agreed that those were the measures, the AG measures, to put in this report. So that's why it's very unique, because it is three different type of stakeholders that have come together and said, okay, those are the ones. However, it doesn't mean that they are all implying those mitigation measures at the moment, of course.
Perfect. Thank you. Um, there's a couple more questions in the chat. Andrew Shine asks if it would be possible to get a link to the specific study mentioned on the red-throated divers. That's you, Daniel, isn't it?
Yes, it's me. Yeah, I will need to dig this out, but I can find it and I can share the link with you to circulate to participants.
Perfect. Thank you. And William asks, do any of you have recommendations for the minimum distance from shore for a wind farm development? I think probably a number of factors have to go into that decision. I don't know, maybe Sarah, you want to mention some of those factors that you think should be considered when deciding on the distance from shore?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many in terms of the operation of the site, what's feasible in terms of the resources that are available to support the operation. In terms of protecting the environment, it really comes back down to assessment of the area, and it will vary. I don't think there's a standard that we could rely on. I think every area needs to be assessed independently. But perhaps, Daniel, there's a minimum distance for nesting seabirds and the like that needs to be taken into consideration that you would be more knowledgeable about than myself.
Yeah, I also don't have a specific recommendation on this. I mean, yeah, it will very much depend on the site. I think it's relevant to say for birds, typically the further offshore you go, the less sensitive the area becomes for them. But yeah, we don't as BirdLife have a recommendation for a minimum distance. And I think like factors other than ecological factors also need to be taken into account when you're deciding on siting of a wind farm. So
Absolutely. Thank you both. Okay, next question for Sarah. Has a cost-benefit analysis been done on the nature mitigation measures by you or any of the wind energy companies? Oh, you're muted.
Apologies, Jenny. Possibly by the wind energy developers themselves, but not by ourselves for Store Blue to date.
Okay, thank you. And for Daniel, have BirdLife done any work on underwater noise impacts to diving seabirds? I've never heard of any studies on on underwater impacts on birds. It's an interesting one.
yeah, no, we as BirdLife haven't done any work on this, and I'm not aware of much research that has been done on this. So it's a current gap. I mean, there is research out there in terms of how foraging within offshore wind farms changes. But I think very few of these link this to impacts from underwater noise. It's mainly due to, well, they mainly look at the presence of the wind turbines in the area.
Yeah, perfect. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. I have one last one for all of you. So you've all kind of discussed about how developers and governments around Europe and the world are already using or testing some of the measures that you've discussed, whether it's mitigation or biodiversity friendly design. How can we, and Sarah, you touched on this, but how can we in Ireland ensure that the lessons learned in those other countries are taken into account here? And what advice would you have for government, developers, but also for the environmental sector or the general public on how we can ensure that those lessons are brought forwards into Ireland?
Yeah, so I go first, Jenny.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think learning from overseas case studies is really critical. So that is part of the research policy project that we'll be doing with the Department of Environment and the Marine Institute over the next 12 months for Ireland as well, is having a look across Europe, seeing what case studies have been successful and the learnings from them and bringing them back to an Irish context. So I think that has to be an ongoing effort. It can't stop. But I think on a national level, there needs to be incentives through policy and permitting here. So a streamlined process so that if developers considering including, pretty innovative nature inclusive design technologies or measures that have not been tested before in these parts. And of course, we only have Arklow Bank, which has not deployed any nature inclusive tech, that it needs to be supported and they know the process to go about that. So I think having the right policy in place and the permitting process to support the integration of these technologies and advanced measures is critical too.
Thank you, Sarah. Manon, maybe you have something to add here?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. I would say keep talking. I think it's very important that all the stakeholders, all the key stakeholders involved in the projects keep the dialogue. And as we have seen in ocean and mid-ocean, it is working. So different interests, of course, different companies or organizations with different interests can sit down and talk and agree on common ground. So I think this is absolutely key. And this is also key to learn from others, learn from the good practices, but also what has not been, what didn't work in a certain context can also help the others to not replicate the same mistakes.
Great. Thank you, Manon. Daniel, anything to add?
No, I think mine is similar. I mean, there's lots going on out there. So just making sure that developments in Ireland are informed by the latest scientific knowledge, but I think also ensuring that for mitigation measures that are implemented in wind farms in Ireland, that there's proper monitoring and reporting on this so that this can then inform future developments.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you. And just to wrap this all up, I just wanted to point to the MARÉIRE website once again, where you can find all of the opportunities we have open. So if anyone currently watching is a researcher, we do have research grants. We also post regular tenders. We currently have one out for research into co-location of maritime uses at sea. And also, we've just published our first report on identifying knowledge gaps on the impacts of offshore renewable energy on biodiversity at sea, which you can find on our website. And lastly, just to say that our next webinar will be in February 2026 and will be on the topic of community ownership in offshore renewable energy. So you can find more you'll find more information on that when I post it on our website and on our LinkedIn pages. Just once again want to say thank you very much to our guest speakers, Manon, Daniel, and Sarah, for sharing your insights into these topics. I think they've been really valuable and a reminder that this is being recorded or has been recorded. And so the recording of the webinar, along with any resources, will go onto the website.